under the supervision of Professor Amir Shalabi and Professor Tamal Rabi. And today I'll be discussing my thesis topic called Evaluating the Use of Twitter Engaging Customer Satisfaction Effects of a Transit Service Intervention. We're already having issues. Here we go. Okay, so today's outline consists of the following. First, I'll talk about the motivation of the study, some literature background, and the objective of this study, and the case study that will be used for this research. And then second, I'll look at the methodology, results, and discussion for two topics, producing a transit-specific sentiment lexicon and evaluating a service change. And finally, I'll conclude and give some recommendation for future work. So as you know, most of you know that transit agencies measure customer satisfaction surveys using they measure customer satisfaction by using customer satisfaction surveys. And that's the main thing they look at. However, these methods are very expensive usually to conduct. The design itself is limited in scope and usually only captures the general gist of customers' opinion. Therefore, newer methods are being sought for. And one of these is called using the social media platform called Twitter. And what makes Twitter special is that it has a microblog structure where people write very short, concise posts, making it easier to extract meaningful information from and quicker. These posts are usually called tweets. They're found in abundance and they're very cheap to obtain. They're also usually posted in real time and are uncensored, so enabling the capture of people's opinions in the heat of the moment. So the use of Twitter has been on the rise in the transportation field in four main categories. The first one is measuring customer satisfaction. The second is incident detection. Third is understanding the mobility of riders. And finally, communicating and sharing information with riders. For the purpose of the study, I'll be focusing on measuring customer satisfaction. So some brief background. This all started off with conducting sentiment analysis for like a specific data set that is transit-related tweets by using generic sentiment lexicons that were created in the business sectors for commercial use to gauge the opinions of riders. These opinions then were incorporated with other data sources to understand the spatial distribution of opinions of writers from Twitter. After that, semantic analysis was introduced to understand the topics as well as opinions by using keywords to identify topics, and recently by using machine learning algorithms. And then there was also some investigation that was done manually to understand the passenger profiling from Twitter, to understand what type of population Twitter users come from. And finally, the last thing that got introduced recently was social network analysis, where to enable the capture of communities and to understand what type of discussions these communities are talking about, instead of just looking at individual perspective, by using the followership attribute found on Twitter. So many of these studies have acknowledged that the sentiment analysis performance at the moment is low due to the automated methods available, because usually sentiment lexicons that are being used are contents dependent, and therefore the need for a transit-specific sentiment lexicon to enhance this sentiment analysis results is required. Also, many of these studies have shown the applicability of Twitter. However, it wasn't done for a practical use case that would give initiatives for transit agencies to actually use it. For example, a common practical use case to look at is evaluating a service change. And lastly, no one has yet looked at comparing the sentiments, the perception of users from Twitter to vehicle performance indicators such as on-time performance. Therefore, the study will bridge these gaps, and for the overall goal of utilizing Twitter data to help transit agencies enhance their transit service planning and operation by achieving the following objectives. Produce a novel transit-specific sentiment lexicon to improve the accuracy of sentiment analysis. Evaluate the impact of an intervention to show the applicability and reliability of Twitter. as a source of gauging writers' opinions. And finally, to compare the perceived reality of users from Twitter to the actual performance on the field for a commonly used reliability measure on-time performance. So as Professor Amir has mentioned, our case study that will be used is Calgary Transit. The network system is shown to the right, where it consists mainly of 2 light rapid transit lines and 169 bus routes that are composed of standard, express, and bus rapid transit routes. Calgary Transit is very active on Twitter, when their Twitter account is called @Calgary Transit, where they usually post relevant information about their service, and they also respond to questions from their customers. Therefore, Calgary Transit is an ideal use case due to its large transit base and its strong social media presence. So going to our first objective, which was to produce a transit-specific sentiment lexicon, some brief background on sentiment analysis. So it's the main pillar in understanding the perception of writers from social media platforms. It's usually conducted in 2 ways. The first one is either a corpus-based approach, which is a supervised learning method, where you would obtain, for example, a set of tweets, and then you would manually classify them based if they're positive, negative, and neutral. And then you would train these sample to classify other newly tweets. And then the second approach is a lexicon-based approach, which is dominant in the transit literature right now in the use of gauging the opinions of writers on Twitter. And basically, this is just a set of words with a polarity scoring associated to each word. And then from that, we can obtain the classification, the sentiment classification of a tweet. Therefore, for the purpose of the study, we'll be looking at how we can produce a lexicon. So the first step was to see how are these usually generated. So there's 3 ways. The first one is manually. So you would pick a sample of words that you think are related to your topic, and you would use them as your lexicon. The other approach is a dictionary-based approach, which is basically you manually create a seed list of words that contains opinion words, usually consisting of adjectives only. And then these would get expanded using a thesaurus. And finally, the corpus-oriented approach consists of capturing all the words that are found in the corpus that you're investigating, and then these would be your lexicon. And then after now you generate your lexicon, the next step would be to give a scoring to each of these terms. Usually they're done in 3 ways as well, either by manually, getting professional annotators to manually score these terms, or by using probabilistical measures or numerical statistical measures, or a combination of the 2. So for this study, I'll be using a hyper approach that looked at recent research of developing domain-specific sentiment lexicons. So the first step was to collect data from Twitter. So the technique that was used was a web scraping one, where I looked at a module called Twitter Scraper, where I ran a query that captures only tweets that mention Calgary Transit, excluding any tweets that are tweeted by Calgary Transit themselves for a 2-month period. This resulted in a total of tweets of 2,646. The next step was to I actually manually investigated each tweet by the framework shown to the right, where first I looked at removing any noise by looking at if the tweet was news or advertisement. That would be not beneficial for our sentiment lexicon. This resulted in 802 tweets being removed. And then after that, I looked at the tone and language found in these tweets to classify if they were neutral, negative, and positive. So the final tally of tweets that I classified were 1,844 tweets, and their sentiment distribution is shown in the pie chart here, where you can see the majority of these tweets are negative, about 72%. So from these tweets, I used 80% of them were used to create the sentiment lexicon, and then the other 20% was used to evaluate this lexicon with other generic sentiment lexicons that are popularly used. So the next step was to pre-process these tweets to remove extra noise and inconsistencies. So to the right, you can see how a tweet would look like on Twitter. But when we web scrape this tweet, it would look like this. And you can see that there's a lot of noise, such as the URL links and HTML codings and numbers and punctuation. So to really show you what happened to these tweets, here's an example that I created manually, that it has many of the issues found, such as spelling mistakes as well, and station names and mentions of Calgary Transit. So all these words are not really relevant for creating a sentiment lexicon, so I had to pre-process them. So you would end up with a final pre-processed tweet shown here on the bottom, where it would just collect waiting, lot, people, and waiting. And then for each of these words, we would also have some an associated part of speech with it, where I've used the natural toolkit library for part of speech tagging, a very known library to do that. So each word would also be associated with a part of speech, and then based on that, we can use for our next step for generating lexicon. So the approach that was considered to generate the terms in our lexicon was a dictionary-based approach. But instead of manually obtaining the seed list, I used a corpus-oriented approach to form the seed list from the pre-processed tweets we have, where I've only kept words that are adjectives, verbs, and adverbs, since they have some type of sentimental feeling. So from our previous example, the word lot and people would be removed and the word waiting would remain. After that, usually the dictionary-based approach would expand these seed lists using source. However, I've noticed that the source words obtained for the words I've captured usually wouldn't be mentioned in social media networks. So instead, I expanded it using the other word forms found in a dictionary by using a Python library called word forms. So for example, for the word waiting, these are the word forms we would obtain for it. And then like I mentioned before, we'll keep only adjectives, verbs, and adverbs, since they have some type of sentimental feeling. So now we have two types of bags of words, the corpus capture words and additional capture words. However, their convention for their part of speech is different. So I just used the rule-based approach to convert the additional capture words part of speech tagging to be similar to the corpus capture word based on the last characters found in each term. So now returning back to our words now, they have the similar convention of part of speech tagging. The next step was to give a sentiment scoring to these terms, starting off with the corpus capture words, because we have some type of prior sentiment knowledge based on the manual investigation that I've conducted to classify the sentiment of tweets. So I started off with looking at two probabilistic equations. The first one was based on frequency counts, which basically looks at the word that we want to classify and how many times it occurred in the positive. We subtract that by how many times it occurred in the negative over the total times of how many times it occurred in the whole corpus. The next equation was based on a Bayes theorem, a very well-known equation, where we just look at the likelihood of a word being positive, subtracted from the likelihood of a word being negative. So by comparing the results for these two equations using 4 performance metrics called precision, recall, F1 score, and accuracy, we can notice that equation 1 outperforms equation 2's in all category, therefore was taken for the next step. So prior research have shown that modifying probabilistic equations by term frequency, inverse document frequency, a numerical statistical measure actually in a mixed equation, the scoring scheme better. I just wanted to evaluate if that works also with transit-related terms. And what TF-IDF really measures is how original the word is. For example, if you have the word "and," it usually is not, it occurs a lot in tweets, so it wouldn't be that original. While if you have another word, such as harassing, it would be very unique and would have a higher scoring. So I combined the two, the probabilistic and the TF-IDF, by multiplying them together. So now when I evaluated equation 1 versus the modified equation 1, we noticed that the modified equation 1 performs better in all the 4 performance metrics. Therefore, this modified equation was used to score our terms. So now the next step was to score the additional capture terms. So now that we have some type of prior sentiment knowledge based on where the corpus capture words is scoring, polarity scoring, we can use that to our advantage to give the additional capture terms some sentimental scoring. I did this based on a role-based approach where I started off by matching by word. So if the additional capture word matches the corpus capture word, we expect that they would have similar sentiment scoring. There's an exception here. If there were multiple corpus capture word associated with the additional capture word, then I would just take the weighted average based on the frequency counts. If that fails, then I looked at the match by part speech. And what this means is that I looked at, for example, if the word drunk originated from the word drank, and they have similar prior speech, we would expect them to also have some type similar sentimental value. Again, there would be an exception if there were multiple corpus capture word associated with additional capture word, then again, I would take the weighted average based on the frequency counts. And finally, if these two methods fail, then I would just look at where the additional capture word originated from, and based on that, I would also take the weighted average to give it a sentiment scoring. So to compare the results with popular generic sentiment lexicons that are used in the translative literature and are emerging, which were Sentistrength, AFINN, and Vader and TextBlock, we can notice here that these generic sentiment lexicons perform slightly better in terms of precision. However, the transit-specific sentiment lexicon performs way better in recall, and also an F1 score, which is a combination of precision and recall, but which improves it by 7.1%. And if we look at the accuracy, it improves significantly by 18.4% compared to the highest performing generic sentiment lexicon here, which was AFINN. So to summarize the details of the lexicon I created, it contained 1,412 terms. 90% of the terms were negative and almost 10% of them were positive. The scoring distribution of these terms is shown to the right, where it had an average of negative terms average score of minus 0.245, and the positive term average score was 0.254. About 80% of these terms were not found in the generic sentiment lexicon, explaining why the generic sentiment lexicon are having a lower accuracy when it comes to transit-related terms. And for the other remaining terms, 73% of them have similar sentiment classification as the generic sentiment lexicon terms, just validating how the scoring scheme is actually correlates with the manual annotated words done by professionals. Now, the next thing to really further show why the generic sentiment lexicons are underperforming, I looked at several keywords that I usually use for different service quality attributes. And we can see here either these words are not found at all in these lexicons, in the generic sentiment lexicons, or they have a different classification to what they should be in tweet-related, in transit-related tweets. Now, there is some limitation to this lexicon, is that it does not label positive tweets correctly sometimes, due to, you can see here some of the common opinion words that are positive, such as good and better, do not have the right classification. And that's a result of tweets being, transit-related tweets being more on the negative side. And also because there's a lot of sarcasm found in transit-related tweets, for example, as shown here, where we can see there's a lot of positive words that are in a negative tweet. So that's why this lexicon has limitation for classifying positive tweets. However, this is not really a big issue. Well, where I'll show later that positive tweets are not really helpful for evaluating service changes or any type of analysis using Twitter, because of how many negative tweets there are. So the next objective was to look at the service change evaluation. So the use case that I looked at was a new MASc BRT service that was introduced in Calgary Transit on November 19, where 3 new BRT9s called MASc Transit were introduced, shown to the right. This was a really big overhaul of their bus network, where 48 routes were changed, and from now on, we're going to call these treatment routes, while 130 routes were unchanged, and we're going to call those from now on control routes. So the branding of this service change was to provide max comfort, max convenience, and max connections. So the period that was looked at was 2 months before the service change and 2 months after the service change. making sure that there were no other service changes that occurred at that period. The data types that we collected were Twitter, the tweets from Twitter, automated passenger count, and general transit feed specification to calculate on-time performance. So additional control measures that were taken into consideration was the removal of abnormal service operation, which were classified into the following three categories: unplanned service disruption days, regular service operation days, such as holidays, and then the initial transition period that comes with any intervention. For this case, it would be because of drivers still getting accustomed to the roads, as well as the users are still trying to figure out how to use these tools to the maximum. So to do this, I've used the two-step process for only bus-related tweets, since this change was for only for buses, by detecting outliers using a box plot based on daily tweet counts. And then these outliers were further investigated to make sure they were an abnormal service operation. So first of all, I looked at the period before the service change by plotting the counts shown on the y-axis, the count of tweets, and on the x-axis you can see the days. And then the dashed green line shows you the maximum score on a box plot. So we can see here that there are 4 outliers here, 4 days that were outliers. And after manually investigating these days, I've noticed that all of them were disruption days due to inclement weather. Now, if I look at the after, we've noticed that the first 5 days, I classified them as the initial transition period, and they coincided that they were the first weekdays from Monday to Friday. So these were removed. We can also notice that there is no more outliers here. However, there is one holiday in December, which is Christmas, so that was removed. So the next step, now that we have controlled our tweets, was to use a very well-known technique called content analysis to analyze the language and media content based on a very strategical structure where we try to understand the tone and the underlying meaning behind text. And the unit of analysis was tweet, of course. So the number of tweets that were used were 3,185 tweets. So the first thing was to give us semantic labeling. So what topics are being classified, the tweets based on the topics being discussed. And we did this by looking at different service quality attributes, and I'll show how I've obtained those. And then also each tweet was associated with the type of transit based on the bus, whether if it was bus, train, or mix. And these were the Calgary Transit networks based on Calgary Transit network system. Finally, in conjunction to the semantic labeling, we did some sentiment labeling based on the framework shown before to see if the text was positive, negative, or neutral. So for the semantic labeling, I started off with looking at 3 main reports. So the first 2 reports were the European Standard and the Transit Cooperative Research Program, where it included the majority of service quality attributes obtained from prior research. As well, I've looked at the recent customer satisfaction survey conducted by Calgary Transit in 2016, showing the different service attributes that their users care about. And based on these, I've used those as a foundation to generate my own service quality attributes by looking at Twitter discussion to multiply them and expand them. So the final service quality attributes that were collected is shown here. There were 18 of them, which included some that are operational measures, such as travel time, on-time performance, and some that are non-operational, such as safety and security and cleanliness. So after now that we have our tweets ready, I started exploring these tweets to see what type of knowledge we can obtain from these. So the first thing we can notice is that most of these tweets are negative, 73% of them. And if we look at the distribution of how tweets, based on the transit mode that they talk about, we can notice that bus and trains are kind of evenly matched in terms of mentioning. And there's a small mentions of both together. So now that I've tried to plot the semantic sentiment distribution of all these tweets for the full 4 months, where the y-axis shows you the frequency in percent, and then the x-axis shows you different service qualities, and then the bars shows you the sentiment distribution in a stacked form. We can immediately see here that negative tweets are spread across all categories, while the positive and neutral are actually found in specific categories. For example, the positive are found in customer service, where people tend to show gratitude to their drivers and the customer service in general. While for the neutral tweets, they're found mainly in service information availability, where people tend to ask questions, and also found in safety and security, where people tend to report some incidents. So therefore, this showed us that really we should, for evaluating, conducting any analysis, use Twitter. Looking at negative tweets would give us a better better insights. Now, if I split these tweets into their two associated modes, whether it was bus on the left or train on the right, we can see here that bus riders have different discussion than train riders. Bus riders are more concerned with operational measures such as on-time performance, and of course, customer service and service information availability. And when we look at train riders, they're less concerned with the operational measures and more with non-operational, such as safety and security and comfort aspects. Now, the next step was to evaluate the service change by only looking at negative bus tweets. So here the blue bar shows you the performance before, the frequency counts before, and then the orange bar shows you the frequency percentage after. And then on top of each service quality category, we can see the percentage change. So reflecting back on the objective of this intervention, the agency can look at the category that they were, for example, max comfort came with safety and security, service information availability, and external non-server factor. Based on this, we can see that 2 out of the 3 actually improved. When we look at max convenience, we see that both the on-time, the operational measures actually deteriorated. When we look at max connections, we can see that 2 of the 3 categories actually improved based on objectives. So based on all these, then they can evaluate whether they can see based on the customer's perception what improved and what not, and for better and for making better decisions for future planning. So the next step was to really see how does this perception of users really compare to the actual performance on the field. So I've looked at the most discussed category, which was on-time performance. And this was done by conducting 2 types of analyses. The first one was customer-oriented, by using the transit-specific sentiment lexicon created before to get an average overall performance scoring, and by also conducting operational-oriented analysis by combining APC and GTFS data to calculate on-time performance based on Calgary Transit on-time definition between a minute early and 5 minutes late. So the total tweets that were pertaining to this category of on-time performance were 455 tweets. This then was filtered also down to associate each tweet with a bus number. So I've only taken those ones, bus route, and I've only taken those ones. So there were only 434 tweets that were associated with a route number. And below you can see that the count of mentions of a route, for example, 38 routes had 1 mention, 20 routes had 2 mentions, and 13 routes had 3 mentions. And based on this, I've decided to only take routes that have 3 mentions or more, since 1 or 2 are not indicative of performance. So a total of 34 control routes with 197 tweets and 18 treatment routes of 158 tweets were selected for this analysis, for this entire analysis of on-time performance. And the total mentions for each bus route is shown here, where we can see here for the treatment routes, route 1 had the majority of mentions, and route 10 for the control routes had the highest mentions. So the next step was to split them into their specific category, whether if they're treatment before, treatment after, control before, and control after. And here we can see the sample size of tweets. And then based on these tweets, I've obtained an average sentiment score based on the transit-specific lexicon for each one of them. For the operational-oriented analysis, for the routes that I've selected in the Twitter, I've also here combined ABC and GTFS data, where I pre-processed them first to remove any recording issues, and then I merged them. And then I've calculated schedule deviation on a stop level, where I've used departure time to calculate schedule deviation, where I obtained actual departure time from ABC data and scheduled departure time from GTFS data. And then if there's any stops that had missing, they did not have schedule deviation, I interpolated it based on the trip. And then on-time performance was then calculated based on the fraction of scheduled deviations that fall within the specified on-time window definition. Here's the sample size for the different categories. These show you the stops served, the sample size of stops served, and where on-time performance was calculated for each one of them. So here are some results where I looked at several on-time window definitions. We can immediately see here that expanding the on-time window definition improves the on-time performance. However, we can see one of the weaknesses of on-time window definition itself is that if two agencies had different definitions, for example, between -1 minute and 1 minute, and between 0 minutes and 5 minutes, they would have gotten different results in terms of evaluating the service change, where one improved in both routes and the other has deteriorated in both routes. But for the sake of this analysis, we looked at the time window for Calgary Transit, since we would expect some users to know about this on-time window. So here are the results for the actual perception versus versus the actual performance on the field, where the plots show you the 3 y-axis. The first one shown in blue shows you the sentiment score. The red one shows you on-time performance, and the third one shows you the negative frequency counts. And on the x-axis, we can see the sample sizes from before and after, and the types of statistical tests were used to show if there was significance. So by looking at the treatment routes graph shown on the left first, surprisingly, the actual performance shown in the red actually deteriorated, as well as the perception of users shown in the blue. And that was significant enough to be attributed to service change. And now if you look at the control routes, we can see that both the actual performance and the perception of users actually slightly improved. However, this was not significant enough, and that was expected since these routes remain the same and haven't changed. So from these results, we can see that there is some type of correlation between the actual performance on the field and the perception of users from Twitter. To look more closely on treatment routes, I've looked at the common treatment routes between the before and after the intervention by plotting a scatter plot showing the on-time performance after on the y-axis, on the x-axis showing the on-time performance before, where any route below the diagonal blue line means that these routes have deteriorated. Any ones above show that they have improved, and we can see that the majority of them have deteriorated. Now, when I looked at common treatment stops, you can see also that this was a similar trend where a majority of common treatment stops actually deteriorated. I plotted the difference between the on-time performance before and after shown here in a bar plot for the common treatment routes. And we can see the red dots indicate that the stop performance has deteriorated, while the blue dots indicate that the stop has improved with shades in between. So, but based on these, we can depict a couple of things. Is that one, the deterioration wasn't because of specific stops, but instead it was for entire routes. It was because of entire routes. Also, that there is, we can see that they weren't clustered into one location, or it wasn't because of any data issues. So by using this and in combination with what the Twitter users mentioned, we can actually find what type of issues there were. For example, one of these tweets showed that the pathing of the route, because changing the pathing of the route kind of affected the performance based on the perception of users, while the addition of max purple caused lots of bus bunching with route 1. And finally, we can see also there was lots of bus bunching for a normal route that was there already. So combining those two would give a more comprehensive evaluation for transit agencies to make better informed decision. So this, I've shown you here where I've looked at only the overall performance of this service change. Now I looked at also one individual route called Route 1. And the reason I picked that is because it had the most tweets of 48. And where I was only able to pinpoint a location for 37 of them, and that was done manually. Then I plotted the actual performance versus these the perception of users for before the service change and after, before the service change shown on the left and after the service change shown on the right, where the on-time performance is shown on the blue trend line, and the orange bar plots show you the negative tweet counts at each of these. stops where the X actually showed the stop sequence for this route. So we can immediately see here that there's a correlation between negative tweets and the worst performing stops, as well as we can see that people tend to tweet not just at time points, but also everywhere along the route. So based on this, you can see that if we combine the two, the perception of users and the operational measures, it will give a more comprehensive evaluation and better decision making for later on. So I'll conclude now. First, I'll conclude for the transit-specific sentiment lexicon, where I've shown that a combination of probability score based on frequency counts with a numerical statistical score called TF-IDF achieves the best result in comparison to just using a probabilistic score. The sentiment analyses results improved, their accuracy and effort score improved by 18.4% and 7.1% respectively compared to the highest performing generic sentiment lexicons. This alludes to the idea where careful attention must be conducted when using generic sentiment lexicons, since they're very detrimental to the accuracy of results. For the service chain evaluation, I can see I showed that the majority of tweets are negative and are spread across all service quality attributes, where positive and neutral tweets were found in specific categories. Therefore, I recommend for evaluating any new analysis that you look at negative tweets. Also, the study showed the applicability and reliability of using Twitter for evaluating an intervention that can benefit agencies to enhance future planning. And finally, we've shown how customer-oriented measures from Twitter correlate with the operational measures related to on-time performance. And this, combining these two, will give a more comprehensive evaluation and improve decision-making. So recommendation for future work, for the transit-specific sentiment lexicon, the first thing would be to identify, of course, other scoring schemes that can improve on the accuracies obtained here. And also evaluate the sentiment scoring intensity given to each term to make sure it's a correct classification, as well as identify approaches that can deal with the unbalanced data set, since transit-related tweets are more, they're negative. And finally, adapt a lot of rule-based algorithms that are found in many of those generic sentiment lexicons that tailor to linguistics found in social media platforms to improve the accuracy. For the service change evaluation, one of the limitations I found is that I wasn't able to obtain the maximum tweets that I could from such a platform. So having a design generalized framework where we can obtain the maximum amount of tweets to analyze any problem would be beneficial. The second thing is that I've only looked at on-time performance. So if we look at other service quality attributes, it would be beneficial to see how the perception of users from Twitter compared to the actual performance. And finally, it will be interesting to see for a specific intervention, if we have survey results for it, how does it compare to Twitter's evaluation of this intervention? Finally, I'd like to give a special thank you to Professor Amr Shalabi, Professor Tamer Al-Darabi, and Dr. Willem Kulmenhauer for their support and guidance and their insightful feedback and giving me this wonderful opportunity. I'd like to thank you a lot. And also I'd like to give a special thank you to our funders, Calgary Transit, NSERC, and QTech for their generosity. And finally, I'd like to give a special thank you to my family and friends for their support. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Rami. Very interesting indeed. So the floor is open for questions. We have about 10 minutes before the end of the session. So if you have questions, please use the raise hand tool. You could also possibly write your question in the chat box if you wish. To get things started, I was not clear about one of your recommendations about dealing with the unbalanced data. Can you elaborate on this? Just to explain what you mean here.
Okay, so for when I created the transit-specific sentiment lexicon, there were a lot of negative tweets. So that caused a lot of common opinion words, such that are positive, to get a wrongly classified polity score. So therefore, if we can actually deal with this unbalanced data set to increase more of the positive tweets by using there's a lot of methods out there to deal with that, to actually improve the scoring on the positive opinion words.
I see. Brendan?
Hi, Rami. It's very, very interesting. I am a little curious, I guess, about a couple of things related to the fact that the reactions are more negative along the attributes after the improved service, the introduction of the BRT, than before. So I guess there are two questions. One was, you had that snapshot where you compared the negatives before, and the negatives of the control routes versus the treatment routes. I guess just your own opinion of what was going on. Is it that they just misjudged the running times? I don't quite understand why there were whole routes that had problems. And the second question is sort of related to that, is how do you think the users measure on-time performance? Because the schedules are only at time points. Are they using, did you get the feeling they're using apps to sort of predict when the time is, and then they get upset when it takes more than what they usually take? I'm just curious how users actually measure on-time performance and perceive it.
Okay, so for your first question, it was beyond of the scope of the study, but after investigating the Twitter discussion, I've noticed that a lot of these users noticed that a lot of these routes coincided with the original routes that were found in the pathing. For example, Route 1, they introduced Max Purple and Max Orange that follow Route 1's direction exactly. So that caused a lot of bus bunching, and that kind of deteriorated the service for these routes particularly. In terms of your second question, yes, they do measure on-time performance on apps. And that's why to really get an indicative feeling of what perception feel, I've used GTF's data, as that's what mainly is used in these apps to really show these schedules. So yeah, they do measure it based on apps, and that's how they really relate to on-time performance, if it's late or not based on just time point scheduling. Some of them rely on schedules, but most of them rely on the text. Calgary Transit has a text tool that tells them timings as well. So if they send the bus, they would tell them when it would arrive. So they also rely on that as well.
Okay, can I just follow up? So the text system you just mentioned, that text the scheduled arrivals?
Yeah, that's a scheduled arrivals, and then as well.
So then they can compare the scheduled arrival for when it actually comes. Okay, well, that's interesting. It sounds like in the bus bunching, it's a combination of misjudging running times and lack of control for the to avoid the bunching. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up, I see Tamer's hand raised, but just to follow up on this comment, I think it would be intriguing to see really at what point people get ticked off by a late bus. You know, those on-time performance windows of -1 and +5 is kind of arbitrary. But I think we have an opportunity here with, I think, Twitter analysis to start to see when people actually start getting too annoyed by a late bus, and so that could actually inform really a more a proper definition really of those on-time performance windows. But I know that it's a little bit beyond the scope of this work, but maybe some future work can look into that. Tamer?
Well, I see that there is a question from the attendees, and I think they should get priority. So maybe you should. I think it's from Ruben.
Okay, Ruben, yeah. So Ruben is saying, just wondering if in setting up your scoring, whether you take into consideration the actual Twitter users, i.e., if a specific user has multiple tweets to Calgary Transit on one or more performance issues, would there be an extra factor applied to their tweets, or should there be?
No, I haven't taken that in consideration, to be honest. And Due to the lack of data set, I don't really recommend that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting comment. Yeah, if someone, is tweeting continuously on the same issue, for example.
Yeah, it should be kind of like removed if it was like multiple tweets on the same hour,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah, that should be also included, I guess.
Tamir, your turn.
Yeah, one question, Rami. Can the same approach or a modified version of it be applied to Instagram?
I'm not really familiar with Instagram, but isn't it like a lots of picture URL and so on? Like, do they say text on Instagram that much?
I think they have text there and stuff like that, but
because what I know from Instagram is mainly like pictures and so on, but that would require some type of modeling to understand the pictures then.
no, I'm talking about the text in Instagram.
Oh, the text in Instagram, yeah, it would work, of course. If it's easy to obtain the information from Instagram itself, like Twitter provides you with an interface that you can do that. I'm not sure how it is with Instagram itself.
And I guess the same would be applicable to TikTok if we transfer the video into text.
Yeah, of course.
There's a follow-up comment from Willem. He says, my guess is that Instagram users aren't as real-time in their messaging or posting compared with Twitter. So, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, it would be very hard to implement to like the other platforms. Like Twitter is more real-time. I'm not really sure of the other platforms, especially that they're more video and picture formats. So
yeah, the reason I'm asking this is that I think among the younger generations, Twitter is seen as a very heavy, older thing.
True.
And many agencies actually asked us, like, so can we use that with Instagram? So it came from them. And I never thought that, wow, people take pictures and post them and say TTC is good or bad and stuff like that. And so the younger generation mode of communication is Instagram and TikTok. And maybe that's something that could also be, I guess, looked into.
I've seen some recent research where they looked at how they can classify the opinions of pictures. So that would be interesting.
Yeah, well, assuming that's the picture of themselves, but if they are a picture of a garbage can or something like, in any case, it was surprising because like 2 or 3 years ago, we thought that we are at the cutting edge of everything. We are getting Twitter and it doesn't get better than that. And then the generation is beating us again.
Okay, any more questions? We have 2 more minutes before the end of the hour. Would you like to make any concluding remarks, Rami?
It was a really nice journey. Like I really enjoyed it so much, and I would like to give a special thank you again to you guys for providing me with this opportunity. Yeah, I've learned a lot of things. It was pretty interesting switching from structural engineering to transportation. They have 2 significant, like they deal with 2 different things totally.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
Well, for those who don't know, this is actually the 2nd master's degree for Rami. He finished 1 degree from Western University in structural engineering. So I'm not sure what's next, environmental engineering, geotechnical.
No, sticking to transportation. I like the field.
Yes. Good. Well, it was indeed a pleasure really having you, and also learning really from you through this journey. We've learned quite a few things from you as well. So it was a really pleasure having you. So on behalf of everyone, thank you so much, and all the best in your next stage in your career. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wishes, Rami.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everyone. And We have a presentation tomorrow by Lisa Lee, master's thesis presentation on also using the same data set from Calgary Transit, but looking at how people actually seek itinerary information and how they use transit apps. So it should be an interesting presentation. So hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.